Well, for more on the situation in Japan, let's now talk to Jan Haverkamp. He's a nuclear power expert at Greenpeace in Brussels. Thanks very much for joining us here on RT. Now, many experts are rejecting fears of a possible nuclear disaster, but we've already had 3 explosions in as many days with reports of radiation reaching harmful levels. What's your assessment of the situation from what you know so far?
Well, 3 explosions and a hydrogen fire in a spent fuel pool. And especially that last one was the reason for the soaring radioactivity levels that we saw then afterwards. The situation at this moment remains critical. It will remain critical for several days. The operators there, and they have to work with, there's only 50 people allowed on the plant at the moment, and they work in 15-minute shifts, which is very little, and they have to work very many things by hand because remote control installations have gone down. The main operator room is not usable because of high radiation levels. They're working under extremely difficult circumstances to try to prevent the worst from the worst, which would indeed be a core that is completely dry and that would lead to a meltdown. Now, given the shortage of cooling water and pumping capacity that there is at the moment, that chance is still existing, and that will exist for several days to come.
Many people talking about meltdown. What does that mean exactly? Yeah. What are the implications of a meltdown?
In case of a meltdown, what we would see would be a core that is completely dry. So the fuel would be completely standing dry, not being cooled anymore. The heat that is still coming off, and that is in the order of magnitude of several megawatts still, would make the core melt, falling down. The fuel would come out of its pipes, so to speak. It would fall down on the floor. There would be hydrogen produced in larger amounts, which probably would cause an explosion. It either would melt through the metal of the reactor vessel, or it would explode through it.
Okay, so what?
In that case, it would get into the atmosphere.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is an explosion of radioactive material. What impact would such a catastrophe have, not just in Japan, but when you're talking about a massive amount of radioactive material released into the atmosphere and indeed into the water, into the sea? What impact, ecological impact, could that have in a wider area, in the Asian Pacific region and beyond?
That is very difficult to estimate. Remember that we've had several of those accidents before. Mayak 1957, Chernobyl 1986. We've had, of course, the nuclear bomb tests, but all of these are very specific, and also this catastrophe is very specific. It is very early now to predict what would happen because it would depend on how much of the material would get out. It would depend on what the sea streams would be, what the wind would be. What is certain is that the spread of this material in the air would not go as far as that we've seen with Chernobyl. The reason for that is that it will not be boosted as high in the air because there is no graphite in it like in the Chernobyl reactor. That means that most of the radioactivity would fall nearer to the nuclear power station, but there it would create larger havoc than we've seen it in the case of Chernobyl. Also keep in mind that the surroundings of these nuclear power stations are a lot more densely habitated than we had known in the case of Chernobyl.
We haven't got a lot of time. You're from Greenpeace, and your stance on nuclear energy is pretty widely known. You would prefer not to have nuclear energy. What impact could this have then on the future of nuclear power, not just in Japan but around the world now?
There was talk about a renaissance of nuclear power, and I think this might be one of the factors that brings the reality to the people. And the reality is that nuclear power is on its way out. There are less nuclear power stations coming online than there are switched offline already for over a decade.
But nuclear power is safe in Europe, isn't it? I mean, Europe doesn't face tsunamis and earthquakes. Is it not safe and clean in Europe?
Also, we have earthquakes. Also, we have natural catastrophes. And if there is one thing that we've learned from the Japanese experience, it is that if you are hit by, let's say, an earthquake as a natural disaster, the last thing you want to see is you also have to spend part of your capacity preventing a nuclear catastrophe. If an earthquake happens in Bulgaria or Romania, it also will have devastating effects on a nuclear level. That is something that we would have to prevent. Also in Germany or in France, those are also seismic active areas.
Jan Haverkamp, nuclear power expert at Greenpeace, joining us live there in Brussels. thanks for joining us on RT.
You're welcome.